In December 1944, as the Allies assumed Germany lacked the capacity for a major strike, Hitler launched one final desperate offensive. His goal was audacious: to pierce the Ardennes, seize the crucial port of Antwerp, and split the Allied front in two. To accomplish this, he relied on his most elite forces, including the feared 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, a unit forged on the Eastern Front, equipped with Tiger tanks, and commanded by seasoned fanatical officers. One of its notable leaders was Joachim Peiper, a young SS officer renowned for his aggressiveness and unwavering loyalty to the Nazi regime. Peiper led an armored column at the forefront of the Ardennes advance, supported by figures such as Max Hansen and Werner Puchta, responsible for reconnaissance and armored support battalions, respectively. On the Allied side, American forces were caught off guard. Frontline troops were scattered, with many recently arrived from training. Nevertheless, the Allied reaction was rapid. Bastogne was surrounded, yet the 101st Airborne held firm, and within 48 hours, Patton's Third Army maneuvered north to launch a counteroffensive. The 1st SS Panzer Division, once celebrated as Hitler's personal guard, had evolved significantly by late 1944. Years of continuous combat on multiple fronts had depleted its veteran corps. What remained was a blend of fanaticism, experience, and exhaustion. During campaigns on the Eastern Front, the division had earned a reputation for aggressiveness, ruthlessness, and adaptability in urban combat, sieges, and blitzkrieg-style counterattacks. Those experiences shaped its operational style, emphasizing rapid movement, improvisation under chaos, and brutal efficiency. However, by Normandy in 1944, the division had suffered catastrophic losses, with many experienced officers killed or incapacitated. When Hitler ordered Operation Wacht am Rhein, the division was selected to spearhead the attack on the Western Front. Peiper commanded an armored column composed of battle-hardened veterans, inexperienced recruits, and remnants reorganized after the French campaign. While many of their vehicles were new, crews often lacked experience. Winter conditions, mountainous terrain, and unfamiliar operational circumstances further challenged the unit. Morale was a mix of pride and resignation. Some clung to hope that the surprise attack could succeed, while others recognized the near-impossible odds. The night before the offensive, tension ran high. Maps were reviewed, routes assigned, ammunition distributed, and convoys organized. Peiper meticulously prepared his column, aware that any delay could allow the Americans to regroup. In the early hours of December 16th, German artillery opened along the front, and fog shrouded initial movements. Columns advanced through forested routes, avoiding major roads. Early success met resistance, and logistical problems quickly arose. Fuel was delayed, heavy vehicles struggled with terrain, and American ambushes slowed progress. Despite these difficulties, orders remained to advance. The contrast between the division's fearsome reputation and its depleted reality became stark. Every kilometer gained exacted a heavy toll, as soldiers battled cold, exhaustion, and constant enemy fire. Communication lines failed, supplies were delayed or intercepted, and vehicles were abandoned, later captured by the Allies. Peiper's forces continued to fight fiercely but were stretched to their limits. While Nazi propaganda projected confidence, soldiers increasingly focused on mere survival rather than victory. For the Americans, the Leibstandarte still posed a threat, but what they encountered in the Ardennes was a shadow of its former might. Each village seized and tank lost chipped away at the division's image of invincibility. Harsh weather, determined resistance, and resource shortages accelerated attrition. The offensive had begun, but for many in the division, the battle was less about winning than staving off the inevitable. Meanwhile, General George S. Patton's Third Army, advancing through France and Luxembourg in mid-1944, had established itself as a critical counteroffensive force. Under his command, the 4th and 10th Armored Divisions played pivotal roles, selected for their mobility, discipline, and effectiveness against enemy armor under extreme conditions. The 4th Armored Division, led by General Hugh Gaffey, had proven itself since Normandy and was organized into 3 combat commands: CCA, CCB, and CCR, each capable of operating independently. This configuration allowed the force to be divided into smaller, more agile units suited to different types of terrain and objectives. Patton considered this division his favorite, both for its aggressiveness and its ability to execute. In December, the 4th Division was one of the first to be mobilized north toward Bastonia. They advanced rapidly from Ireland, crossing frozen villages and icy roads. However, the maneuver came at a high cost. One of its battalions lost 33 tanks in the attempt to break through to the besieged city. The troops encountered a fierce defense from the German 5th Parachute Division and a self-propelled gun brigade, which halted their push at Martelange, about 20 kilometers from the objective. Patton accepted no excuses. He gave the order to press forward without pause with the clear message, "Advance without looking back." He knew every minute counted. The pressure was on to fulfill his promise to reach Bastonia before Christmas. Thessaly was surrounded and the 101st Airborne was holding out without reinforcements. The general was confident that his push from the south would open a gap in time. The 10th Armored Division, for its part, had a different but no less critical role. It was tasked with defending the southern flank of the encirclement. While the 4th attempted to reach the encirclement from Arlon, the 10th held key positions to prevent German units from advancing eastward and overflowing the line. Its light and medium tank battalions along with motorized infantry faced repeated attacks, with terrain conditions that complicated each movement. The 10th Division soldiers operated in small villages, sometimes bogged down by snow and other times cut off by enemy artillery. Despite numerical inferiority in certain sectors, the division managed to hold the line, stemming German advances that sought to exploit its flank. Its role was to contain, resist, and give Patton's mobile forces time to execute a counterattack. On December 22nd, Eisenhower himself formally authorized Patton to launch the offensive from the south. The order was to halt the German advance, liberate Bastonia, and cut the enemy line toward Huels. To this end, Patton organized an initial assault with 3 divisions: the 26th, the 80th, and the 4th Armored Divisions. These units were to move in a coordinated manner along different routes, but with the same objective: to break the German offensive at its base. The 26th Division, commanded by Willard S. Paul, advanced from the south, covering more than 25 kilometers before making contact with German forces near Wiltz. They faced the Führer's Grenadier Brigade, whose commanders were put out of action in the first hours of the encounter, causing disorganization among its ranks. It was one of the first engagements where the Americans managed to dismantle an enemy unit without being exposed to immediate counterattacks. The 80th Division under Horace McBride moved in parallel and encountered heavier resistance near Brook. German soldiers of the 352nd Volksgrenadier Regiment made a stand in urban areas, sparking house-to-house fighting. Despite the obstacles, McBride's managed to consolidate their positions. Meanwhile, the 10th Armored Division continued to defend the eastern portion of the line. On the right flank, the 5th Infantry Division arrived from Ectan to reinforce the offensive. Although part of its force was still deployed to the east, one regiment was assigned to coordinate with the 10th Infantry. Both units planned a counterattack against the German Volksgrenadier Division, which was attempting to control the high points north of the Sauer River. That same day, General Charles Daun received orders to reinforce the defenses in the rear, especially along the Meuse River. Demolitions were prepared for more than 250 bridges in case German forces reached that area. This action sought to halt any crossing attempt and prevent the enemy from gaining access to logistical depots or routes to Verdun. Despite this, the command was confident that Patton's blow from the south would prevent them from reaching that point. Coordination between armored personnel, infantry, artillery, and engineers was key. The Third Army's divisions were not perfect, but they were organized so that each could adapt to new orders quickly. The combat commanders knew how to operate under pressure, and many of them had fought since the Normandy landings. At the tactical level, the American armored divisions were divided into 3 operational commands that acted as combined units. Each included tanks, mechanized infantry, self-propelled artillery, and reconnaissance units. This allowed them to attack in small groups and respond quickly to changes in the terrain. Unlike the Germans, who relied on routes and massive concentrations of vehicles, the Americans could divide their forces to more effectively flank, defend, or cut routes. The Fourth Army also had the support of the 87th, which assumed part of the 4th Division's front, allowing its complete concentration on the advance toward Bastonia. This tactical reorganization allowed Patton to concentrate fire and force on the enemy's weakest points. Over the next few days, the pressure on Patton's divisions increased. The terrain conditions were adverse. Frozen roads, visibility limited by blizzards, mines hidden under the ice. Nevertheless, engineer teams cleared routes while tank columns advanced. In some sectors, the forward forces had to face ambushes by German units hidden in nearby woods. In one such advance, the 4th Armored Division reached Martelange, where Ytre took the initiative and forced the Germans to fall back. Sherman tanks and motorized infantry vehicles advanced in close formation, facing anti-tank fire from ruined houses and improvised fortifications. Despite the losses, they managed to keep the route open for 48 hours, allowing reinforcements to flow north. Air coordination also played an important role. Although the weather hampered flights when there was a clearing, Allied fighters attacked the German lines and cleared sectors where the armored columns were advancing. This relieved some of the pressure on the soldiers fighting on the front lines. The performance of the 3rd Army divisions in those days marked a turning point. They not only withstood the German pressure, but also managed to reverse the pace of the offensive. Operational discipline. The experience accumulated since Normandy and flexible organization made it possible to keep the offensive going even with limited resources and under extreme conditions. By the end of December, the units under Patton's command were no longer just a holding force. They had become the engine of the Allied counterattack in the southern salient. The 4th and 10th Armored Divisions, along with the infantry divisions supporting them, demonstrated they could act as a coordinated offensive bloc. Patton's success was not due to technical or material superiority. German tanks were still more potent in one-on-one duels, but the 3rd Army divisions compensated for this disadvantage with maneuver, speed, mutual support, and a command that did not hesitate to push to the limit. The 3rd Army was advancing, and that meant the German plan was beginning to unravel. Hitler launches his final blow, the December 16th offensive. In the final Hitler launches, his final blow months of 1944, Adolf Hitler faced collapse. The Eastern Front was retreating in the face of the Soviet push, and in the West, the Allies were at the gates of Germany. Against this backdrop, the dictator decided to launch a final offensive in the West. This was neither a defensive operation nor a tactical retreat. It was a total gamble. The idea was to surprise the Allied forces in Belgium and Luxembourg, divide their lines and force a strategic shift in the war. The plan was surnamed Wacht Amren. The objective was clear. Launch a large-scale attack through the Ardennes, advanced toward the Meuse River, and capture the port of Antwerp. Taking that point would cut the Allied front in two and shatter its logistical system. For Hitler, this could change the course of the war. The order came directly from the Führer. From his headquarters in East Prussia, he personally oversaw every phase of the design. He ignored the objections of his top generals, who considered the idea unfeasible. The terrain was difficult. The winter weather hampered mobility and resources were limited. Despite this, Hitler ordered the concentration of sufficient forces to launch the offensive. The offensive was planned quietly. The German High Command mobilized nearly 30 divisions, including Panzer, infantry, paratrooper, and Volksgrenadier units. A new armored formation, the 6th Panzer Army, was created under the command of Sepp Dietrich. Other shock groups were also prepared, such as Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army and the 7th Army, tasked with covering the southern flank. Troops began to position themselves secretly. Night marches, radio silence, and secondary routes were used to avoid detection. Some units traveled up to 500 kilometers on foot or in vehicles for several weeks to reach the starting point. In parallel, tanks, cannons, and fuel depots were camouflaged in forests and small towns. The disguise worked. Allied intelligence services detected no unusual movements. By mid-December, everything was ready. The troops were concentrated along a front of more than 130 km in an area that was believed to be secondary. The Kozan area in the Ardennes had already been used in 1940 during the invasion of France. At that time, the German army had managed to surprise the French. Hitler hoped to repeat the move. The difference was that this time the enemy was different, attrition was greater, and time was against them. On December 16 at 5:30 a.m., the offensive began. A barrage of more than 1,000 artillery pieces opened fire on the American positions. The bombardment lasted nearly 2 hours. It hit command posts, lines of communication trenches, and logistical routes. The intention was to paralyze the enemy's ability to respond before launching the infantry. Once the preparatory firing was completed, the armored units advanced. The terrain was covered in snow and ice. The roads were narrow, slippery, and flanked by forests. Despite this, the German columns began to advance deep into Allied territory. The morning fog prevented aerial reconnaissance, giving the attackers an advantage. The Allied front line was made up of inexperienced American divisions. Some had been on the front lines for a short time. Others were in quiet sectors after previous engagements. In several cases, the units were outnumbered and outgunned. Confusion spread quickly. Lines of communication were cut, and many platoons were isolated, uncertain whether to retreat, resist, or withdraw. On the northern sector, the 6th Panzer Army moved slowly but strongly. Among its columns was Kampfgruppe Piper, an elite grouping of Tiger and Panther tanks tasked with opening a path to the Meuse River. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army managed to penetrate between the positions of the 28th and 106th American Infantry Divisions. In the south, the 7th Army secured the flank against possible counterattacks from the Luxembourg region. The attack took the Allied High Command by surprise. Their reports considered a large-scale German offensive in that sector unlikely. Most resources were concentrated in the Ardennes region, where a frontal attack was expected. The German gamble on the element of surprise paid off within the first 24 hours. However, not everything was working as planned. Congestion on the advance routes slowed the movement of armored vehicles. Some roads were blocked by damaged vehicles or stuck in the snow. Engineers worked tirelessly to clear the way, but the slowness in logistics was beginning to show. The most advanced columns were being distanced from their supplies. The weather was another obstacle. Temperatures were below zero. Engines froze, weapons failed, and soldiers suffered from frostbite. Nights were long, and movement was slow. Troops had to move in close formation, which made them more vulnerable to ambushes if the enemy reacted. Despite everything, Hitler ordered them to press on. He was convinced that victory depended on maintaining the momentum. He gave instructions that the advance should not be halted due to lack of fuel. The use of captured reserves was prioritized. The confiscation of abandoned enemy depots was also authorized. The objective remained Antwerp within the German command. Some generals remained hesitant. They believed the front was stretched too thin, and that success depended on variables beyond their control. But the Führer balked new objections. He had defined the operation as the blow that will decide the fate of the Reich. The first 48 hours of the offensive showed mixed results. In some sectors, troops advanced without resistance. In others, the Americans were beginning to organize their defenses. The lack of coordination between German columns led to bottlenecks. Some key points were not captured in time. The Allied reaction accelerated. On December 17, more intense fighting erupted. In several towns, German troops briefly took control before being driven back. Allied communications began to reorganize. Reserve divisions were sent north. Eisenhower mobilized armored units from France. The first holding orders were issued. Despite the problems, the offensive continued. The German command believed it was still possible to break through the front and reach the Meuse, but the accumulated delay was beginning to reduce the possibilities. The initial advantage of surprise was disappearing. Congested routes, fuel shortages, and growing resistance complicated the outlook. In Berlin, propaganda spread the message that the offensive was achieving its objectives. There was talk of a great victory underway. Images of advancing tanks, recaptured villages, and cheering troops were used. But at the front, commanders knew the margin for error was minimal. Every hour counted. The first reports of Allied counterattacks arrived on December 18th. Some positions retaken by the Americans indicated that the front was not completely broken. Piper continued to advance, but with difficulty. The supply line was lengthening and river crossings were not being taken in time. The advance was slower and more vulnerable. On the southern sector, the response was swifter. Troops of the Third Army began to reorganize. General Patton was already planning a turn north to halt the offensive. News of the attack had reached all levels of the Allied command. It was no longer a surprise, it was open battle. Operation Watch on the Rhine continued. Hitler was confident that the advance would reach the Meuse before December 24th. From then on, he believed that political chaos on the Allied side would force a withdrawal. But on the ground, actual conditions did not align with that expectation. Snow, enemy resistance, and execution errors threatened to halt the advance prematurely. December 16th marked the beginning of the Third Reich's final attempt to alter the course of the war in the West. It was a calculated, risky attack based on the hope of an Allied collapse. In its first hours, it generated confusion, retreats, and concern among the enemy commanders. But the question was not whether it had surprised, but whether it could sustain itself long enough to achieve its objective. Kampfgruppe Piper. A bloody advance to the Meuse. On December 16th, before dawn, Kampfgruppe Piper was ready. The column of more than 100 armored vehicles waited on a forest road near Blankenheim. The engines roared almost as the initial bombardment began. The group was the shock force of the 1st SS and had only one instruction: advanced swiftly toward the Meuse River, leaving all resistance behind. Joachim Piper, at 29 years old, was already considered a feared officer. He had fought in Russia, where his group had burned entire villages. He was a devoted Nazi, despised commanders, without field experience, and demanded total dedication from his men. In the Ardennes, he was assigned the central role to break the Allied line and create chaos. His route was Rollband D, a secondary road that passed through Hansfeld, Billingen, Stavelot, and Tuapons. On the first day, his unit broke through the Losheim Pass without significant resistance. They reached Hansfeld on December 17th and captured large quantities of fuel. Piper forced American prisoners to load his tanks at gunpoint. The column then continued toward Bullingen, facing enemy artillery and airstrikes. At Lingouville, Piper encountered armored vehicles from the 9th Armored Division. There was fighting, but the column did not stop. They advanced, firing in all directions, leaving no enemy alive behind. In their wake, they left destruction and fear. For 2 days, his column traveled more than 40 kilometers into enemy territory. They crossed frozen forests, destroyed villages, and narrow roads. The terrain was difficult, and weather conditions made every meter cost time and fuel. The column stretched and lost contact with its flanks. Despite this, Piper continued to push. On December 18th, the group reached Starlet. Piper did not stop to secure the town, confident that the units behind him would retake it. Instead of digging in, he decided to continue toward Tuapon, seeking to cross the S River. But by the time he reached the bridge, the engineers of the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion had already blown it up. The first German tank fell into the water. Faced with the obstacle, Piper turned northwest following the Amblev Valley. He took La Glace and crossed the river at Chenou. He was attacked by American fighters. He lost several vehicles. Even so, he managed to cross the stream with part of his column. He then attempted to advance toward Wehremont, but the road was so narrow that damaged tanks blocked the way. It took hours to clear the road. While this was happening, the engineers of the 291st Battalion destroyed another bridge at Nerf-Miller, blocking the passage to the Meuse. Piper was forced to return to La Glace, now with the column fragmented and running low on fuel. Malmedy, the crime that unleashed Allied fury. On the morning of December 17, 1944, a small American column from the 285th Artillery Observation Battalion crossed Malmedy towards Saint-Vay. There were about 140 soldiers. At 11:45, they passed through the Bonnet crossroads, where they encountered a line of German tanks advancing toward the intersection. The vehicles belonged to KF Grouper Piper, the vanguard of the 1st SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. The tanks opened fire without warning. After a brief unequal exchange, the Americans surrendered. They crawled from their trucks, hands raised. A German tank officer with a clear English accent told them, "The 1st SS Panzer Division welcomes you to Belgium, gentlemen." No one answered. They all knew what it meant to be in the hands of the SS. According to post-war accounts, before the offensive began, Hitler had urged the 6th Panzer Army to advance without any human containment. There are no documents confirming this order, but many soldiers understood that they should not waste time with prisoners. Some officers, like Piper, considered it an implicit directive. Others, like Warrant Officer Ernst Clare, claimed to have received explicit instructions not to leave any Belgian civilians alive or capture any enemy. On that December 17th, the American prisoners were gathered in an open field near the Café Baudarway, a few steps from the crossing. The cold was intense, and light snow was falling. The group was surrounded by German soldiers. Meanwhile, other members of the camp grouper continued the march toward Ligneuil. Piper passed near the site in a half-track, joking with the prisoners, "It's a long way to Tipperary, boys." As time passed, more soldiers were brought to the camp. Around 2 on, without a clear order and without warning, several Germans opened fire. Some used submachine guns, others automatic rifles. The Americans fell where they stood. Some tried to escape, others feigned death. Soldiers like James Mata managed to flee in the snow. Others took refuge in the Café Baudary, but the Germans set it on fire and shot those who fled. Between 3 and midnight, only 17 survivors managed to reach the American lines. Some were wounded, others nearly frozen. One hid for hours under the icy water of a stream to avoid discovery. It is estimated that more than 80 soldiers were executed at Bonnet's camp. Others died in the initial firefight. For many survivors, the image of their comrades falling without any chance of defense was forever etched in their memory. One of them only managed to say, "We had no chance." The news reached the headquarters of the American First Army that same afternoon at 16:30. The next day, it was relayed to Eisenhower's headquarters. Within hours, it was decided to make the incident public. The emotional impact was immediate. By the evening of Monday the 18th, most Allied soldiers at the front knew what had happened. The reaction was swift. In the Umbel Valley, as Piper faced imminent defeat, he received reports of confusion in his rear. Major Gustav Nitt explained to him in German, "A good number had been eliminated at the crossing." It was the first time Piper had heard of the event that would forever mark his reputation. The effect on the American troops was clear. On December 21st, a regiment of the 26th Division issued an internal order. No SS soldiers or paratroopers will be taken prisoner. They will be shot down instantly. Although this directive was later withdrawn, several testimonies suggest that American soldiers began shooting German prisoners without hesitation. On January 1st, members of the still inexperienced 11th Armored Division executed 21 captured Germans near Schienen. These events were not officially publicized, but they demonstrate how the murder at Malmedy hardened Allied attitudes. German brutality provoked reprisals. The incident at Malmedy was not the only one. Other executions by 1st SS troops were documented. 8 prisoners were murdered at Ligneuil, 12 American soldiers and 3 civilians at Lavaux Richard, several more at Hansfeld, and dozens of civilians at Stavelot. In the villages of Pondra and Renard-Mont, the 3rd Armored Division found the bodies of 117 civilians. Some were killed by Allied artillery fire, but many were eliminated by the SS. The trial for the massacre was held at Dhaka after the war. 74 men were charged, including Sepp Dietrich and Joachim Piper. 43 received the death penalty, 22 life sentences, and others lesser sentences. However, many punishments were commuted. The American defense attorney argued that the confessions had been extracted under duress. Furthermore, evidence was presented that Piper was not at the exact scene when the shooting occurred. Piper claimed that he did not approve of the execution of prisoners, but his official report of the operation described the episode as an annihilation of an enemy motorized column at Beer. His commander, Wilhelm Mohnke, recommended him for a decoration using those very words. The way the term Vernichtung was used in that report suggests they knew exactly what it entailed: eliminating surrendered combatants. There is no evidence that Dietrich knew about the event at the time. He died in retirement in 1968. Piper, for his part, was haunted by his past. In 1976, he was murdered in France when his house was set on fire by unknown assailants. He had lived in hiding for years, moving between countries to avoid reprisals. The crime at Malmö became a symbol of the SS's disregard for the laws of war. Although numerically a minor massacre compared to other atrocities, its moral impact was immense. For the Americans, it confirmed that they were facing not just an enemy army, but an organization without limits. The executions of prisoners, the reprisals against civilians, and the systematic brutality demonstrated the influence of themethods of the Eastern Front. Many 1st SS soldiers had returned from combat in Russia, where killing prisoners was common. They brought that same style back to Belgium. Over the next few days, the story of the crime spread throughout the front line. Officers used the incident to strengthen the troops' resolve. The U.S. media also reported widely on the event. Public outrage increased pressure to punish the perpetrators. On December 23, U.S. forces retook control of the area. The bodies of the murdered soldiers remained in the snow. The scene was photographed and documented. The images were circulated among Allied commanders and used as evidence in subsequent trials. Piper was never acquitted. Although he was not directly present, his role as KMF Grouper commander made him responsible. Post-war trials established that the chain of command bore responsibility for crimes committed by subordinates, even without direct orders. The Malmedy massacre was a turning point. From that moment on, Allied troops viewed the SS as an unscrupulous force. American soldiers in particular stopped trusting any symbol of surrender. The rules of engagement changed. In retrospect, that crime marked the fall of the myth of military discipline and honor that some still attributed to certain German units. The 1st SS had crossed a line, and although they would continue to fight, they could no longer hide their actions. Bastogne under siege. The 101st holds. Bastogne under siege against overwhelming odds. On December 17th, as German forces pushed through the Ardennes, the town of Bastogne became a critical objective. Its significance was not its size, but its position at a crossroads, where 7 major routes converged, vital for the advance toward the Meuse River. The Germans could not bypass it without leaving their rear vulnerable. That morning, the first German artillery shells struck the town center. Thousands of Belgian civilians and retreating American units took cover in the streets. Some reported enemy tanks already at the gates, and tensions mounted with each passing hour. Nevertheless, General Troy Middleton, commanding the WWII Corps, held firm. The Allied command had already mobilized its only reserve, the 68th Airborne Corps. Overnight, in freezing rain, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions moved into Belgium by truck. The journey from Rennes was slow due to snow-covered roads and poor visibility, and some radio transmissions were intercepted by German forces. Enemy planes circled overhead, dropping flares, yet both divisions arrived on schedule. On December 18th, the 101st Airborne, under acting command of General Anthony McAuliffe, took up defensive positions in Bastogne. There was no time for proper fortifications, so soldiers used destroyed buildings, barns, and homes as trenches. Nearby, units from the 10th Armored Division and scattered formations occupied improvised defensive posts. By December 19th, German forces, including the Panzerlehr, 2nd Panzer, and 26th Volksgrenadier Divisions, had nearly encircled the town from three sides. The Americans were cut off from southern supply lines, and air support was impossible due to poor weather. Eisenhower ordered Patton's Third Army to pivot north to relieve the siege, while the 101st braced to hold alone. The paratroopers faced shortages of ammunition, food, and tanks, with no heavy artillery or air cover. On December 20th, the German assault intensified. Troops attacked from the east and northeast, but the 501st and 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments repelled the breakthroughs. To the south, elements of Kampfgruppe Pfeiffer captured nearby Kret and pushed toward Seignonchaux. McAuliffe organized ad hoc reaction teams, combining tanks, artillery, and infantry to plug gaps. By December 21st, the encirclement was complete. Constant German artillery fire left ammunition rationed. Some guns held only 10 rounds, and medical staff worked without morphine as the wounded lay in freezing cellars. That day, General von Luttwitz of the 47th Panzer Corps demanded McAuliffe's surrender. His terse reply, "Nuts," confounded German messengers. One officer later explained it meant, "Go to hell." This reply became a symbol of Bastonia's defiance. On December 22nd, German attacks resumed. The 26th Volksgrenadier tried to penetrate through Borscheid, while the 15th Panzer Grenadier assaulted from the southwest near Seignonchaux. The 2nd Panzer Division to the north remained in reserve. The Luftwaffe dropped fuel barrels, but most missed the defenders. By the morning of December 23rd, skies cleared, allowing C-47s of the Nyack's Troop Carrier Command to drop over 250 tons of supplies, ammunition, food, plasma, and blankets into Bastogne, though some fell outside the lines. The 101st launched localized counterattacks. Task Force Brown held off German forces at Seignonchaux with light artillery and damaged tanks, and the 10th Armored Division prevented panzer advances at Marvy. On December 24th, the Germans launched one of their fiercest assaults. The 15th Panzer Grenadier penetrated the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment's lines and advanced a kilometer to Hemmel, only to be ambushed and wiped out. 200 enemy soldiers killed, not one escaping. That night morale was low, food and ammunition were scarce, and the weather worsened. But the defenders knew relief was approaching. On December 25th, German attacks resumed. The 92nd Panzer Grenadier attempted to seize Neuf, but was repelled by the 51st Parachute Regiment. Further north, the 340th Volksgrenadier pushed into Longchamp and Ubory, gaining ground but unable to consolidate. The Americans endured Christmas with what little they had, sharing chocolate or writing letters that would never be sent. Finally, on December 26th at 4:45 p.m., a combat engineer reported to McAuliffe, 3 light tanks approaching from the south. They look like ours. They were part of Patton's 4th Armored Division, which had broken through the encirclement at Assenoir. The brief communication simply stated, "We're here. Where are the Germans?" Bastogne wasn't liberated, but it was no longer isolated. The corridor opened by the 4th Division was still narrow and vulnerable. Nevertheless, it marked the end of the siege. Soldiers of the 101st were shouting and raising their weapons. McAuliffe said only, "I knew they would make it." On December 27th and 28th, Patton sent reinforcements along the opened road. The 6th Armored and 35th Infantry Divisions advanced from Ireland to widen the gap. The German command recognized the threat. They warned, "There is a strip between St. Cubert and Baston through which the Americans can penetrate at any moment." The 101st Airborne held their positions. Many were not relieved. They continued fighting until January. The siege had been lifted, but the city was still under fire. Even so, the line would not be broken. The siege of Bastogne was a symbol. For the Germans, it represented a choke point. For the Allies, it was proof that they could still hold out under impossible conditions. And for the 101st Airborne, it meant becoming a legend. Patton's pivot. 48 hours to pivot. 48 hours changed the war. On December 19, 1944, at headquarters in Verdun, the top Allied commanders met after receiving the first reports of the German advance in the Ardennes. Eisenhower, Bradley and other senior officers discussed the magnitude of the attack. In that room, George S. Patton went ahead of everyone and offered to move his Third Army north to break the encirclement of Bastonia. He promised that in 48 hours he would be hitting the enemy lines. No one believed he could do it so quickly. Patton had already anticipated a possible German movement in that area. He had ordered his chiefs of staff to prepare 3 pivot plans. When Eisenhower asked him how long he needed to move, Patton replied, 48 hours. General Bedell Smith hesitated, but Patton had already given the orders. His army, composed of more than 250,000 men, prepared to turn 90 degrees on its axis and launch itself toward a new front. That night, December 20th, the 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry Division, and the 80th Infantry Division began to move. The units regrouped in crossing zones south of Bastonia. The roads were covered with snow, the temperatures were below zero, and traffic was clogged with columns of retreating soldiers. Despite this, the engineers opened alternate routes and rerouted convoys to free the main thoroughfares. Patton didn't just move troops. He also coordinated artillery, field hospitals, supply units, and communications, ordered every road cleared with snow plows, and personally monitored weather reports. He left nothing to chance. Ash's men moved. He reviewed maps with the attention of a surgeon. On December 21st, the first elements of the Third Army reached the southern area of the encirclement. The 26th Infantry Division reached Nateau. The 4th Armored Division concentrated at Ardennes. The troops were exhausted, but ready to advance. Patton spoke with his commanders and reminded them of the objective to open a corridor to Bastonia no matter the cost. That same day, General Manteuil, commanding the German 5th Panzer Army, received reports of the Allied movement. He acknowledged that such a rapid turn was unlikely but not impossible. He ordered the approaches to Bastonia to be reinforced from the south, although many of his units were already committed to fighting to the north. On December 22nd, the offensive began. The 4th Armored Division launched itself from Arlon toward Martelange, a town on the Serre River. At first, the advance was smooth, but at Martelange, German engineers had blown up the main bridge. It took the Americans hours to set up a makeshift crossing. Meanwhile, enemy artillery pounded the area without pause. That same day, the 80th Infantry Division made contact with enemy units north of Edelbrook. House-to-house fighting slowed the advance. The 26th Division, meanwhile, faced unexpected resistance at Neuve-Château, where a Volk Grenadier unit was holding its ground. Even so, all 3 divisions continued to push. On December 23rd, the weather cleared for the first time in days. Reconnaissance aircraft confirmed that Bastow was still surrounded, but that the troops of the 101st Airborne were holding. The information was relayed to the Third Army. Patton ordered an accelerated pace. The 4th Armored Division resumed the advance after building a new bridge over the Schur. In the Bigville area, American armor faced down organized defense. The Führer's Panzer Brigade had positioned anti-tank guns in narrow streets. In the fighting, the Americans lost 19 tanks, but continued to advance. The objective was to reach Seninoa, the last town before Bastonia. That day, 3rd Army artillery opened coordinated fire in more than 10 sectors. Patton had concentrated 349 pieces of light, medium, and heavy guns. The fire broke through enemy lines and covered the tank advance. Observers in Bastonia heard the explosions and understood that rescue was near. Logistics were critical. Every tank needed fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and mechanical support. Transportation teams worked day and night. Engineers cleared routes under fire. Radio stations maintained constant communication with units at the front. The system worked. On December 24th, Patton ordered a final push toward Bastow. The battle group, led by Colonel Creighton Abrams, with 45 Sherman tanks and 800 troops, was given the direct mission of opening the breach. They advanced along a narrow icy road flanked by trees where enemy units could hide. On the outskirts of Assenoir, they encountered minefields. The sappers worked at full speed to clear a path. One tank hit a mine and was blown up. Another was hit by anti-tank fire. Despite the casualties, the group continued to advance. The pressure increased with every meter. At 4:45 p.m. on December 26th, a tank from the 37th Armored Battalion broke through the enemy line and made contact with an outpost of the 326th Engineer Regiment at Bastonia. The encirclement had been broken. Troops from the 101st Airborne moved out to meet them. The encounter was brief but symbolic. McAuliffe sent a message to Patton. "Relieved, thanks." Patton responded with a tour note. "Promised, did it." The corridor opened was narrow and still under fire, but the connection was established. Reinforcements began to enter via that route. Supplies began to flow again. On December 27th, the pressure on Bastogne eased. Patton moved more units forward. The 6th Armored Division reinforced the corridor. The 35th Infantry Division deployed east to secure the flanks. The German command attempted to close the gap, but it was too late. Patton's action had changed the course of the battle. In just 2 days, he turned an entire army and broke an encirclement the Germans had planned for weeks. The impact was strategic and moral. The troops of the 101st Army didn't just hold. They had bought time for the 3rd Army to arrive. Success wasn't just a merit of speed. It was a combination of advanced preparation, efficient logistics, direct leadership, and coordination between units. Each division knew what it had to do. Each commander understood the objective. Patton had imposed his style on the entire army. The Western Front changed with that maneuver. The Germans, still trying to advance toward the Meuse, were forced to withdraw units to contain Patton. They lost the initiative. The push from the south transformed the offensive into a defense. Bastonia became the turning point. On December 28th, the German High Command recognized that the advance toward Antwerp was unsustainable. The routes north of Bastogne were blocked. Fuel was running low. Columns like Pipers had already been halted. Hitler's plan was falling apart. In the following weeks, Patton continued pushing northeast. He liberated occupied towns, recaptured vital crossings, and linked his offensive with those of the Allied 1st and 3rd Armies. Coordination increased and the front began to stabilize. The 3rd Army's pivot operation was later studied as a model of operational reaction under pressure. In the midst of winter, with no clear numerical advantage and limited resources, Patton managed to turn an emergency into a successful counteroffensive. The result was more than tactical. Allied morale recovered. The image of German invulnerability cracked. And in Bastonia, where resistance had reached its limit, the soldiers knew they were not alone. Battles between ice and battles. Between ice and steel, ambushes, tanks, and mud. As the German offensive in the Ardennes progressed, it became clear that terrain, weather, and vehicles would play as important a role as troops. The winter of 1944 was one of the harshest of the war. Temperatures dropped below 10 degrees C. The ground was frozen, but with intermittent rains that turned the roads to mud and blocked the passage of tanks. In that region, the hills, thick forests, and narrow rural roads defined the way of fighting. Every bend in the road could hide an ambush. The mobility of motorized columns was limited. Infantry advanced on foot between frozen trees crossing ravines and snow-covered fields. The terrain favored the defender and complicated rapid attacks. American tanks, primarily M4 Shermans, were fast and reliable but light. Their armor could be penetrated by any German anti-tank weapon. They had a low-velocity gun that could barely pierce the front of a Panther or a Tiger. Their nickname among the Germans was Ronsen, like lighters, because they exploded easily when hit. Even so, Shermans were numerous. Each American armored division had around 186 of them, and infantry divisions had an additional battalion of tanks. There were also M5 Stuart light tanks, used more as reconnaissance vehicles, as their 37mm gun was ineffective against enemy armor. The Germans primarily used 3 models: the Panzer IV, the Panther, and the Tiger. The Panzer IV was the most common with a good 75 mm gun, but relatively weak armor. The Panther was preferred for fighting in the Ardennes, fast, well protected, and with a gun capable of destroying any Sherman from long range. Tigers 1 and 2 were feared with an 88mm gun and are more impervious from the front. But they were slow, heavy, and required large amounts of fuel. One of the main obstacles for both sides was the condition of the roads. Many were dirt or gravel tracks, impossible after rain or snow. Heavy vehicles easily got stuck. German tanks weighing 50 and even 70 tons were reported completely stuck in the mud. Some were abandoned without having fired a single shot. The lack of mobility forced a change in tactics. Ambushes became frequent. Tank columns advanced in single file along narrow roads with no room for lateral deployment. This allowed small groups of soldiers to hide anti-tank weapons around bends or at the entrances to towns. The Americans placed mines, fallen trees, and improvised barriers to slow enemy armor. Battles for crossroads became crucial. Seizing or holding a crossing meant controlling the passage of supplies, tanks, and reinforcements. Bastogne was the best-known case, but similar engagements occurred at Saint-Vit, Manhy, Uffalès, and Clairvaux. Often possession of a crossing decided whether a unit could advance or be surrounded. In the north, the American 2nd Armored Division captured the villages of Dong and Marur after heavy fighting against the 560th Volksgrenadier Division. At the same time, the 3rd Armored Division and the 83rd Infantry advanced toward Renier. In all these places, tanks moved with difficulty. The slopes and sharp turns limited their speed to less than 10 km per hour. One disabled vehicle was enough to halt an entire column. Artillery also had problems. Batteries depended on visibility to adjust their fire, but the fog was so dense that in some sectors they could not see more than 300 meters. Observers could not accurately locate their targets. In other cases, the pieces had to be withdrawn for fear of being isolated if the enemy broke through. On December 22nd and 23rd, conditions worsened. Rain, snow, and fog impeded reconnaissance flights. The roads were covered with thick mud. On the 24th, during the final offensive toward Bastogne, the tanks of the 4th Armored Division took 6 hours to travel just 5 kilometers. Each bridge had to be evaluated. Some could not withstand the weight of a tank. The engineers improvised with logs, beams, or parts of other vehicles. The infantry, for their part, advanced slowly. Wet boots caused frostbite. Many soldiers lost fingers or feet. On some days, casualties per trench foot exceeded those caused by the enemy. In many units, medics could barely treat the wounded. There wasn't enough morphine. The frozen ground made it impossible to dig deep trenches. Some used destroyed houses as shelter, sharing the space with civilians, animals, and corpses. In January, with the Allied counterattack underway, fighting continued under extreme conditions. The 2nd Armored Division attempted to advance from the north. Snowy terrain and mines slowed its progress. In many villages, such as Flamier and Recrival, fighting raged house to house with flamethrowers, grenades, and close-range gunfire. Tanks could barely enter the narrow streets. The Germans also faced serious problems. Their Panther and Tiger tanks were superior in armament, but their engines overheated and seized easily. Each model had high fuel consumption. With their tanks empty, many tanks were abandoned. Some crews destroyed them with explosives to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Others were captured intact. The uneven terrain forced German armor to advance in tight columns with no room to maneuver. Sept Dietrich, commander of the 6th Panzer Army, summed it up this way: "Only 4 or 5 tanks can fight at the same time. There's no room to deploy. A massive armored attack is impossible here." A shortage of spare parts worsened the situation. The Germans used captured vehicles, including French and Italian models, for which there were no spare parts. Mechanics improvised repairs with incompatible parts. In many areas, tanks were used as static artillery placed on rises to cover roads because they could no longer move. The Americans, although they had a logistical advantage, also suffered. The mud affected both trucks and armored vehicles. The 2 and 1/2-ton GMC vehicles were reliable but sank easily on the unpaved roads. Sometimes an entire battalion would be held up for hours waiting for a single vehicle to be towed. In the midst of it all, ambushes were constant. In the Grobo forest near Spinner, paratroopers of the 551st Battalion were surprised by the 62nd Volksgrenadier. Nearly all were killed. In another sector, the 17th Airborne Division took recall but was hit by German artillery before consolidating its position. Survivors described how the snow turned red in minutes. On January 6, the 18th Airborne Corps attacked in a heavy blizzard. The men could barely see each other. Enemy fire came from ice-covered trees. American artillery could not provide support due to poor visibility. Advances were measured in meters. In some cases, it took 2 days to capture a single village. In the Till area, the 87th Infantry Division faced the Führer's escort brigade. The resistance was fierce. Every house was defended like a bunker. The Americans lost more than 100 men in a single day. However, they managed to reach the road to Mer. East of Bastonia, the 6th Armored Division resisted attacks at Nefer and Warden. German artillery pounded. American tanks covered with lime for winter camouflage repelled night attacks among frozen trees. They slept with their feet wrapped in newspapers. They ate frozen rations. Some used dynamite to break up the soil and bury their dead. The mud, fog, and forests determined the pace of the battle. Victory depended not only on tanks or guns, but on physical endurance, steady logistics, and adaptation to the environment. The Battle of the Bulge was more than anything a war of attrition under the most extreme conditions. The first SSR retreat and defeat runs out of fuel, jam, retreat, and defeat. On December 20, 1944, as the German offensive reached its deepest point, KF Grouper Piper was trapped at Laglies. Fuel reserves had been exhausted. Communications with the rest of the 1st SS were almost zero. Reports sent to Priest's headquarters confirmed the situation. Not a drop of gasoline, barely any ammunition. That day, 1st SS Commander Hermann Priest admitted that Piper's group could no longer advance or defend itself effectively. Attempts to airdrop fuel failed. The Luftwaffe was unable to carry out its missions due to the weather. Jerrycans were falling outside the perimeter or being captured by the Americans. On the 21st, the situation did not improve. The 2nd SS Panzer Division reported that its units could not leave the assembly area due to lack of fuel. Reports spoke of tanks stopped, artillery IMO, and entire battalions waiting with no possibility of entering combat. Meanwhile, the 9th SS Panzer Division reported that only its reconnaissance battalion was mobile. Neither its Panthers nor its artillery pieces could be moved. That same day, Camp Group Upnit attempted to cross the Amblev River to assist Piper, but was repulsed by the American 30th Division. The bridge at Stavelot was blown up by Allied engineers. Germans who tried to ford the water were shot down. The escape route was sealed. To the south, other groups of the 1st SS were also stuck. KF Group Hansen, after failing to cross at Petit Spy, had to fight without tank support. Its attempt to open the road to Tuapan was repelled by paratroopers of the 55th Regiment. American engineers blew up the remaining bridges, forcing the Germans to retreat. Piper, out of options, ordered the destruction of their vehicles. Entire units burned their tanks and guns to prevent capture. On the night of December 23rd to 24th, some 800 men left Lagels on foot, crossing between Allied lines. They managed to return to German territory but left all their equipment behind. By December 24th, the 1st SS offensive was at a standstill. The lack of fuel had been an insurmountable obstacle. The Panthers, Tigers, and Panzer IVs required large quantities of gasoline, and supply routes were saturated or destroyed. The rugged terrain and winter weather doubled the expected consumption. Many tanks had only advanced a few kilometers before becoming immobile. The problems had been brewing since before the attack. On the night of December 15th, the 1st SS Panzer barely had enough fuel to mobilize half of its divisions. The remainder was diverted from the 2nd SS Panzer, under the false premise that it would not be immediately needed. That decision had fatal consequences. The German High Command's logistical planning had been poor. Distant depots had been accumulated, safe from bombing, but out of reach of combat units. The quartermaster headquarters were unaware of the true objective of the operation and did not prioritize frontal supply. The result was a broken chain. There was gasoline on the Rhine, but no trucks to deliver it to the Ardennes. On December 25th, units of the 2nd and 9th SS attempted to join the fight, but could barely move a portion of their forces. The 2nd Battalion of the 9th S equipped with Panzer IVs received limited fuel. The Panthers did not leave their R until the 28th. By then, the momentum of the offensive had been lost. Panzer Lehr reports also showed difficulties. At Morsy, Its soldiers had to empty jerry cans by hand to fuel the engines. Supply was based on small quantities collected by each battalion. The same was true of the 116th Panzer Division of its 23 available Panthers. More than half were stalled due to lack of fuel. Piper, upon returning with the survivors of his comm-grouper, did not hide his frustration. He declared that they had not been told the truth about supplies. His unit was credited with advancing further than any other in the offensive, but at a very high cost. 70 tanks lost, hundreds of men killed, and failing to achieve its objective of reaching the Meuse. On December 26th, with the arrival of the first units of the Third Army at Bastogne, it became clear that the German plan was crumbling. The panzers were trapped on collapsed roads. Mud mines and blockades impeded any movement. The Allied gasoline depots at Spar and Stavelay, which could have saved the Germans, had already been evacuated or destroyed. In the following days, German commanders began ordering a withdrawal. The priority was to save soldiers, not vehicles. Tanks without gasoline were blown up by their own crews or abandoned by the roadside. The withdrawal was chaotic, without air support, and under constant Allied pressure. On December 28th, the German High Command acknowledged that the objective of reaching the Meuse was unattainable. Hitler ordered them to hold the positions they had achieved, but the officers knew that a withdrawal was inevitable. By January 1st, many SS battalions were no longer fit to fight. Their forces were broken, disorganized, and poorly supplied. The lack of spare parts also played a role. Many damaged tanks could not be repaired. They cannibalized each other, but time was running out. In several divisions, mechanics tried to reactivate vehicles using incompatible parts. Some armored vehicles were used as fixed firing points buried in the snow to serve as static cannons. On January 3rd, the Oberkommando reported that the offensive had to be halted. There were insufficient reserves. Only a small fraction of the 1st SS remained operational. Most of its tanks were destroyed or immobilized. Its troops without transportation walked back through the Ardennes. Operation Wak Amrin had failed. Fuel more than bullets or soldiers had been the decisive factor. The planners had relied on capturing Allied reserves rather than securing their own supply lines. That gamble proved costly. The withdrawal of the 1st SS marked the end of the myth of its invulnerability. Although still feared, it was no longer a force capable of turning the tide of the war. Its attempt to cross Belgium had ended in logistical disaster. Starting on January 5th, the SS divisions were regrouped and sent eastward. Hitler needed them to halt the Soviet offensive. What remained of the 1st SS embarked for the Eastern Front with few tanks, fewer soldiers, and a shattered reputation. The Battle of the Bulge proved that without fuel no offensive was possible. No matter how veteran, fanatical, or well-armed they were, the men of the 1st SS could not advance beyond the limit marked by their empty tanks. The final collapse. The 1st SS facing its ultimate defeat. On January 1, 1945, while Hitler wastering to salvage his offensive by launching parallel attacks in Alsace and against Allied airfields, the reality in the Ardennes was different. The 1st SS Panzer Division was exhausted. The soldiers were spent without logistical support or prospect of victory. Their withdrawal from the Bastonian front had already quietly begun. On January 3rd, the Americans resumed the offensive across the entire salient. The 6th Armored Division advanced toward Warden while the 35th Infantry Division pressed from Leutram. In the German rear, the 1st SS received orders to concentrate in the Svit area. It was an implicit acknowledgement that its offensive role was over. On January 6th, Hitler authorized for the first time a partial withdrawal from the salient. The order included the 6th Panzer Army, which was to fall back toward the West Wall. The plan was to conserve what remained of their units for the Eastern Front, where the Soviet offensive was already preparing. The 1st SS would be one of the first to leave. That same night, units of the 1st SS fought at Lutraba against the American 35th Division. It was one of their last offensive actions in the region. Then they retreated north, crossing frozen roads under artillery fire. The terrain was mined. Artillery fire. The terrain was mined. On January 9th, while American troops recaptured Harlang, the German High Command ordered the remnants of the 1st SS to regroup near St. V for transfer. There, under constant air surveillance, they waited their turn to embark for the east. The order had been clear: abandon the Western Front and head for Hungary. That same day, Patton initiated a counteroffensive from Bastogne. 8 Allied divisions pushed northward amid biting cold. Retreating German forces destroyed documents as they withdrew, and the roads became congested with mixed columns of infantry, artillery, and remnants of armored units. On January 11th, the U.S. 90th Infantry Regiment sealed a pocket near Oberwamp, trapping the remnants of the German 5th Parachute Division. The 1st SS attempted to carve an escape route but failed, leaving the Parachute Division virtually wiped out. Only small groups managed to flee on foot. This marked one of the final combat missions of the 1st SS in the West. By January 12th, with the Soviet offensive underway along the Vistula, Hitler shifted full focus to the Eastern Front, ordering all available units, including the 1st SS, 2nd SS, and 12th SS, toward Hungary, a slow and challenging redeployment. On January 13th, as Americans consolidated positions around Huels, German forces sought escape along unbombed routes. On January 15th, Hitler abandoned his Western command post and returned to Berlin, acknowledging the Ardennes offensive had failed and focusing on defending the capital. On January 16th, American 1st and 3rd Army units linked up at Huels, completing the encirclement. Remaining German forces tried fleeing along secondary roads, but were decimated by Allied artillery and airstrikes, which intensified under clear skies. By then, the 1st SS had largely withdrawn from the front, with its last elements transported to Austria and Hungary between January 17th and 21st. The movement was slow. Trains were delayed by track damage and air raids, and some never reached their destination, forcing units to reorganize upon arrival. Meanwhile, officers from other German divisions expressed anger, viewing the SS retreat as a betrayal. Regular infantry held the line while elite divisions withdrew. German high command attempted to reassure troops that the SS would return reinforced, but morale was low. By the end of January, the losses were staggering. Of more than 2,500 armored vehicles on the Western Front in mid-December, only 800 remained operational. The 1st SS retained barely a dozen serviceable vehicles in its armored regiment. By January 25th, Allied forces had erased the Ardennes salient, restoring the front line to its original positions. U.S. troops advanced into Luxembourg, retaking towns like Clevo, Meschede, and Hosside. On the 26th, the 6th Armored Division reclaimed Weisswamp, and the 90th Regiment secured Grindhausen. That same day, the Soviet offensive in East Prussia commenced. Hitler ceased referencing the Ardennes, as the Western withdrawal had concluded. Many units, however, were unable to escape, with Allied airstrikes destroying hundreds of vehicles and supply depots. By January 30th, OB West reported only 813 armored vehicles combat-ready across the Western Front. The 1st SS, once the spearhead of the offensive, scarcely appeared in operational reports, effectively eliminated as a fighting force in the West. Human losses were severe. The division suffered over 2,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing. Some were trapped in pockets, others captured during final skirmishes. Entire destroyed SS columns were discovered in various Belgian villages. The 1st SS's reputation was tarnished. Although its soldiers fought tenaciously, the failed mission, wartime atrocities, and pressured retreat shattered the myth of invincibility. It was no longer a feared unit, merely another exhausted division of the Reich. The transfer to Hungary offered no respite. In February, the 1st SS was thrown into Operation Südwind to halt the Soviet advance on the Danube. Still recovering from the Ardennes, its men faced combat again, with many never returning. The Ardennes offensive had ended. For the 1st SS, it marked the beginning of the end. Its military prestige obliterated, its combat effectiveness shattered, and its legacy permanently defined by defeat, retreat, and the Malmedy massacre.